So we've been working our way through the acronym BLESS, which we finished all 5 of the letters last week, to help us to know how to love and reach out to those people in our lives who don't know Jesus. So I just want to ask you, as you look at these words that go with each of these letters, begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, story. I want to ask you how you're doing on it. Are you praying for someone? Did you begin with prayer weeks ago and start praying for an opportunity, or have you been praying for someone? Are you praying for someone in your life that you want to bless? Have you had an opportunity to listen to anyone? To close your mouth and open your ears and really listen for the purpose of understanding and getting to know someone else's heart? Have you invited someone to a meal with you, or for coffee, or lunch, or dessert, or to get together around a table? Have you been able to do that? Have you found an opportunity to serve someone who doesn't know Jesus, so that they would know that our God is a servant, that Jesus came here not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many? Or have you had an opportunity to tell a story, a God story, about how God has worked in your life? You know, this is what we talked about last week. If you missed it, you can catch it online to just revisit it. The story is something where you just say, I don't know, God just did it. God just did it. And we all have those stories. Last week, I carved out some time for us to share some stories, and we had more stories than we had time. So I promised a little time for that today. And if I don't take up too much time myself, I'll leave us a little bit to do a little bit more sharing of our God stories. So the passage that we're going to look at today, we've been looking at encounters between Jesus and individuals as they're recorded in the gospel. And the one that I read to get ready for today, as I read it through, it's not very long, it's a short passage, I've read it many times. When I got to the end of it, I had more questions than I had answers. Have you ever done that? Read through something in the Bible, and you just end up with a lot of questions, and you think, the Bible's supposed to answer my questions, but when I read it, I have questions. That's how this one worked. This was the story of Jesus. He's in a crowd. He's surrounded by a crowd of people. And a woman who's had some kind of bleeding for 12 years. She's been bleeding. The Bible doesn't say what her problem is, but she hasn't been able to get it resolved. She's been to the doctors. She hears about Jesus. She squeezes herself through the crowd thinking, if I can just touch the edge of his garment, if I can just touch the hem of his robe, maybe I'll get healed. And she somehow manages to grab it. She's immediately healed. She knows she's healed. She feels it in her body. And Jesus says, who touched me? Now there's one of my first questions. Isn't Jesus supposed to know everything? Why did he ask who touched me? Did he not know in this case where there's so many people around? Was he like, okay, someone touched me. Who touched me? And then he said, I felt power go out from me. Another question. I thought Jesus was in control of his power. Is he like some kind of power grid that's always vibrating, and if all we have to do is touch him, we get a zap? What did he mean, I felt power go out from me? And why was she squeezing through the crowd? Why didn't she just stand up and say, Jesus, heal me, like other people have done? Call out to him. I have questions about this passage, and we're going to work through it. I'm going to actually read it now instead of just paraphrase like I just did. And we're going to get answers to those questions, and we're going to understand the heart of Jesus a little bit better. And we might, some of us, even see ourselves as that woman, or as the disciples who witnessed it all, or as the crowd who was squeezing around him. I wonder which one you're going to relate to most today. Here's the passage, Luke 8, 42 through 48. Jesus was on his way. The crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, no, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Now this starts out with saying Jesus was on his way. It says, as Jesus was on his way. And I've mentioned before, whenever I read that, I have to go read what was written before to find out what he was on his way from. So if you just back up and read a little bit of the scripture before that, you discover that a man named Jairus, who was a synagogue ruler, a man well respected, a man very well known, who was in charge of the synagogue, came to Jesus and said, Jesus, my daughter is sick. She's so sick, I think she's going to die. Would you come heal her? And Jesus said, yes, let's go. That's the scene. That's the context. This man Jairus has asked Jesus to come. Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' sick daughter. That's where the crowds come in. They know something's going to happen. They're following Jesus. They're pressing in against him because he's going to heal a very sick girl. And this woman who squeezes through the crowd to reach the hem of his garment, what is going on with her? We've got this very important man and this very unimportant woman. We've got to remember those two things. Jesus is on his way to the home of a very important, well-respected man, and he's being sneaked up on by a very unimportant woman. She touches the hem of his robe. What does Jesus do? Jesus stops. What would I do? I might tug the garment and keep going. I might pretend I didn't feel it. I'm on my way to a very important appointment with a girl who is dying. Mark adds about the woman that she heard reports about Jesus. That's how she got there. She heard reports, she heard things about Jesus, and she thought, if I just go see him, maybe I'll be healed. I was thinking about that. You know what I think we need today? I think we need more reports about Jesus. Amen. Outside these walls. I think we need more reports about Jesus so people will hear more about Jesus and say something like, maybe I should go check that out. Maybe I should go check that Jesus out. These people are talking about him like he's something worth checking out. She heard reports about Jesus and said, maybe I will go see if any of these things are true. She wanted to go unnoticed also. I don't know if you caught that in this passage. When Jesus said, who touched me, everyone denied it. No one answered. She didn't say it was me until he pressed the issue because she wanted to go unnoticed. In verse 47, it says, when she realized she wasn't going to go unnoticed, when she realized she wasn't going to be able to sneak away, she said, it was me. Why would she want to go unnoticed? Why was she just trying to squeeze through the crowd and touch the hem of his garment? Why wasn't she on the side of the road like the blind men were, saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me? Why wasn't she crying out? Why was she sneaking? Do you know what it was like for a woman in Jesus' day in that culture? They weren't allowed to be out there shouting out. They weren't allowed to be close to the crowd. They were supposed to be quiet. And especially someone bleeding, anyone bleeding, was considered unclean. You weren't allowed in the temple. You weren't allowed near religious people. You weren't allowed near people. Because if you had a bleeding and you wanted to go to the temple, you had to get the bleeding stopped. You had to get all cleaned up, go through a lot of rituals before you were accepted in to the synagogue. And if you were bleeding and you came close to me and you touched me and you got your blood on me, now I have to go through all that. Because now I'm unclean too. I've got to wash it off. I've got to go through rituals. I've got to get approved to go back to the temple. I don't want that hassle. So if you're bleeding, stay away from me. That's what people felt at the time. She was a woman, keep quiet and stay behind the crowd. And she was bleeding, don't get near anybody, you're unclean. No wonder she wanted to go unnoticed. And it also says that she had been bleeding for 12 years. Mark adds, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this story, and they're very similar, but each one adds a little bit more detail. What Mark adds to it is that she had been seen by many doctors who couldn't heal her. I think it's interesting that Luke, the doctor, in his account, didn't mention doctors. He was protecting his own. Let's not mention that she went to a lot of doctors. Let's just say she had trouble getting better. Mark had no problem with it. She went to 12 doctors. None of them could help her. Imagine what that would feel like. Well, not 12 doctors, 12 years. Many doctors. How would you feel if you had an illness, a struggle, something you were trying to get better from, and you went to doctor after doctor after doctor, year after year after year, and you never got better? No doctor helped you. Every time you'd go to the next doctor, you would be a mix of hope and disappointment. You'd be a mix of, maybe this is the one. Maybe this doctor will figure out what's wrong with me. Maybe this doctor will help me. You'd have a little bit of hope, but you'd have this huge bucket of realism that said, the last bunch of doctors haven't helped me, so this one might not either. So I think, if I can get into this woman's mind just a little bit, I think that's partly why she wanted to go unnoticed. She's thinking, and this is just me speculating now, she's thinking, what if it doesn't work? I've heard these reports about Jesus. If I just get close enough to touch his garment, I just want to get close enough to touch him and see. If it doesn't work, I'll just sneak away unnoticed. I won't have to own up. I won't have to tell anybody one more failure. Would you like to feel one more failure? I would not like to feel one more failure. I think the combination of her being a woman, her bleeding and being unclean, and half hope and half fear that it wasn't going to work, made her sneak up like that. What do you think? I think I might do the same thing if I were her. I might not jump out in front of Jesus and say, Jesus, hold it. I need healing. I might sneak up from the back and just try to grab the hem of his garment. And why the hem? Why his garment? It was a tradition for the Jewish people in that day and all the way back into the Old Testament that their priests who would make sacrifice in the temple wore very specific, very ornate garments. You can read about it in Leviticus, in the Old Testament, about the breastplate and the garments, and everything they wear was very specifically designed and articulated by God. One piece of their garment was the hem on the bottom of their robe. It was wide, and it had bells attached to it and tassels, so that when the priest walked and the robe moved, you would hear the tinkling of the bells, so everyone knew when the priest was coming. It became part of their mindset in Jesus' day that the hem of the priest's garment was a holy thing, was a special thing. So maybe that was in her mind. Maybe she's thinking, I can't get all the way to Jesus, but if I could just touch that holy hem, maybe I'll be healed. This is what I think is going through her mind. And Jesus, just like we have seen in all the other accounts we've looked at, he stops. Jesus is interruptible. You remember me saying that a few weeks ago? Jesus is interruptible. He's on his way to do something really vital, but he chooses to stop. I was sitting in on a life group last Sunday morning. We have a life group that meets on Sunday morning, and they're discussing the book Bless. And they were on the chapter that has this story in it. And they were discussing this whole account. And someone in the group said, what if Jesus had kept walking? And I said to her afterward, I said, that question's a good question. I'm going to think about that this week, and you might hear it next week. So here it is. I didn't ask it originally, but it's a great question. What if Jesus kept walking? Jesus stopped. Jesus stopped. He must have stopped for some reasons, but I'm thinking about the stopping compared to the walking. So I back up a little bit further and I say, what is Jairus feeling about this stopping? Jesus was on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. Jesus stops to talk to this woman who's not important to everyone in the crowd. And what happens while Jesus stopped? The daughter dies. How would you feel if you were Jairus? And you asked Jesus to come heal your daughter, and you're on your way, and you know every minute counts. And Jesus stops to help a woman who's already healed. He could have kept going, but he stops to talk to her, and while he's talking to her, your daughter dies. I think there's something really important in that scene right there for us to get our minds around. Because here's how we tend to think. We tend to focus on the parts of a story. Jesus sees the whole thing. Jesus knew that Jairus' daughter was going to die before he started the journey. He knew he would get there too late. He knew that if he stopped to help this woman, it would delay him and he wouldn't get to Jairus' daughter in time. But he knew he would still get there to raise her from the dead. Nobody else knew that. All they knew was Jesus stopped and the daughter died. And we do that. I do that. I focus on the part. Say, Jesus, why did you stop? Jesus, why aren't you helping me right now? And I forget that Jesus sees the whole picture. Jesus knew before he started that walk that he was going to heal that bleeding woman and he was going to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead. No one else knew that. We only know the parts. So there's a good reminder in this for us to say, Jesus knows the whole picture. Jesus sees the whole picture when we sometimes only see the parts, and we draw conclusions based on just those parts, which in my case are sometimes wrong because I don't see the whole picture. Jesus does. So what if Jesus kept on walking? What about the woman if he had kept on walking? She was already healed. She could have gone home healed. I read an interesting take on this. A couple months back, Heidi and I were reading as part of our morning quiet times, we were reading a book on prayer. And the author mentioned this story, and she said, here's how I would have been if Jesus had kept walking. And I was the woman, and I reached out and grabbed the hem of his garment, and I got healed, and he kept going, and I went home. I might have been thinking about the hem of that garment. And she said, I know my mind. I would have started thinking about, do I still have symptoms? Have I started bleeding again? Did I get fully healed? Maybe I need to go back. The author said, I would have gone back with scissors, snipped off a piece of that garment, and brought it home with me so I could hold it, have it, touch it, worship it. Aren't we a little bit like that? The power didn't come from the garment, it came from Jesus. In our case today, in whatever we're involved in, the power doesn't come from our thing. It comes from Jesus. The power doesn't come from sitting in the chair. The power doesn't come from singing a song. The power doesn't come from holding the Bible. The power comes from Jesus. But we have this tendency to want to grab onto the things. And it's not new. Do you remember the account of Jesus being transfigured? When his face changes into the radiant glory of the fullness of God, and Moses and Elijah appear there, and Peter's there. What does Peter say? This is great. Let's build some shelters and stay here forever. Because we want to grab onto the thing. I think that's a little bit what's happening here. And Jesus said, who touched me? This was one of my big questions. Why did Jesus say, who touched me? Why didn't he just keep walking? Why did he stop? He knew who touched him. I believe he knew who touched him. Do you believe he knew who touched him? Just show me if I'm the only one in the room. Raise your hand if you think Jesus knew ahead of time who touched him. Why would he ask that then? Why would he stop? Why didn't he keep walking? Why would he stop and say, who touched me? I had to remember, and it's good for us to remember, that with Jesus, whatever he says or does, it's always about the other person. It's always about the other person's need. Remember with the deaf man, Jesus did 3 nonverbal things. He touched his ears, he touched his tongue, and he sighed, he looked toward heaven. It was like giving him sign language that says, I know you're deaf, I know you can't talk. Your Father in heaven, it breaks his heart, we're going to heal you. Without a word, Jesus communicated all that. To the man who was blind, Jesus didn't touch him. He spoke. He talked about God's grace and God's mercy and light. The man had never seen light. Jesus always does what the other person needs. So if that's true, why did he say, who touched me? Was it for his own sake? No. It was for her. It was so she would come out of hiding. What that sounded like to me was all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve sinned. God came walking through the garden, and what does God do? This is always a puzzling question. He said, Adam, where are you? Like God didn't know. God knew where Adam was. He's hiding behind that bush. Why did God say, Adam, where are you? Because he wanted Adam to come out of hiding. He wanted Adam to choose not to hide. He wanted Adam to come forward and say, here I am. So I think this is what's happening here. Jesus said, who touched me? And he waited. Peter said, are you kidding? Everybody's touching you. Jesus said, no, tell him, someone touched me. I felt power go out from me. And finally, the woman realized she was going to have to come forward. Because Jesus doesn't condemn. He doesn't point the finger. He doesn't accuse. He calls. He invites. I think he was inviting her to come out of the crowd. And then what about that power thing? No, he said, no, I felt power go out from me. Why would Jesus say that? It depends how you read that line. I tended to always read it like this. Power has gone out from me. Like power went out from me. I know it happened because power went out from me. What if he said it like this? No, power went out from me. Maybe he's trying to make it very clear to the woman and the crowd that the power didn't come out of his garment. That the power's not in the robe. The power's not in the hem. The power came out of me. I don't think he's saying it like he was shocked. Uh-oh. Power just slipped out of me. I think he was saying it was like, hey, everybody, I want you to know she touched my garment, but the power came from me. That's how I read that. So I was glad to go back and think through those things because honestly, I've had those questions for a long time. Like, why did she sneak? Why didn't he keep walking? Why did she touch the hem of his garment? Why did he say, who touched me? Every time I've read this account for years, I've always said, he knew. Why did he ask? And what is that thing about power? So I feel good today that I had to study this week and answer those questions and get a perspective from that prayer book that really helped me and to say, okay, this is our Jesus. He stopped because he wanted to engage that woman. He stopped because he wanted it to be clear who did the healing. He stopped because he wasn't risking losing a little girl. He was still in control of the whole thing. And he spoke words that mattered to clarify it for everybody. The word that's used for healed in this passage, when he says to her, and what beautiful words. He says to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Daughter. The word for healed, the Greek word there, actually means saved. So what was she saved from? She was saved from bleeding. She was saved from feeling like an outcast. She was saved from being refused temple access. She was saved from feeling unimportant. She was saved from feeling like she didn't matter. She was saved from feelings of loneliness. She was saved from being ostracized from society. My hope, we don't know because the story doesn't keep going, probably your hope too, is that she came to the point where she was also saved from her sin, where she went away from that encounter saying, Lord and God, I give you my heart. That part of the story isn't there for us. Maybe we'll run into her in heaven one day, and she'll say, by the way, I was saved from my sins too. So one last point on this account that's so important. It was when I started reading through this was my number one takeaway, and then in my mind it got lost by all the other things I was learning. Here it is. This passage starts with this line. It says, as Jesus was on his way, Luke 8:42. That's the start of it. As Jesus was on his way. Every account we've looked at so far over this Divine Encounters series has started with some line like this. I pulled up a few that we've actually looked at over the last few weeks to remind us. As Jesus was on his way, that's today. As he went along, we read that in John 9:1. As Jesus went on from there, was in Matthew 9:9. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, was in Luke 19:1. Every divine encounter that we've looked at has started with as Jesus was on his way. It's important for us to remember that. Jesus told this story about the Samaritan who helped the man along the road. The man was injured. He was left for dead on the road. Two people passed him by, and a Samaritan man came by. And this is what Jesus says. It's in Luke chapter 10, verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. When he saw him, he took pity on him. This Samaritan in Jesus' story wasn't out looking for someone to help. He wasn't looking for someone wounded and laying by the side of the road. He was passing by. He was out traveling. He was on his way. And he saw the need, and he stopped and helped. So maybe that's your take home today. As you travel, as you go your way, as you walk your road, as you go from here to there, bless somebody. Listen. Look. Watch for the need to serve, an opportunity to tell your story along your way. It sounds a little bit like the Great Commission Jesus gave us, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. The last words he said to his disciples that gets transferred to us today. Jesus came to his disciples and said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That phrase in verse 19 that says, therefore go, it's an ongoing word. It's not a one-time go and we're done. The tense of that word could be translated like this, and some of your Bibles actually do, in your going. So we could read it like this. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. As you go along, in your going, make disciples of all nations. In our wording today, it would be, as you go, bless the people in your life. Be praying, be listening, join them at the table, serve them, tell your story.